My name is Zuri, and at 32 years old, I had finally achieved my ultimate goal. After decades of being the designated family scapegoat, I secretly founded a massively successful private equity firm and purchased my absolute dream lakefront mansion. I bought it to recover, relax, and finally find peace away from the suffocating expectations of my parents and my golden child brother. But on my very first night in my new home, my brother called with an announcement that made my blood run cold. "We are moving in tomorrow," he declared. "Dad already approved it. If you do not like it, you can find somewhere else to live." My hands shook with a lifetime of suppressed anger, but instead of crying like I used to, I just smiled and quietly prepared a welcome they would never forget. The next morning, the locks had been changed, and two armed police officers were waiting at my gate. Growing up in our affluent African American community, respectability was the only religion my parents truly practiced. My father, Pastor Calvin, and my mother, First Lady Beatrice, ran a prominent local megachurch that catered to the city's elite. To them, public image was everything. Our brick colonial house with its manicured lawn looked perfect from the outside, but inside, emotional coldness permeated every corner. I was the quiet, analytical daughter who preferred studying financial markets over socializing at church functions, which made me a constant disappointment. My brother Trevon, who is 3 years older, was the undisputed golden boy. He was undeniably handsome, charismatic, fast-talking, and possessed an incredible talent for masking his constant failures with grand, empty promises. The contrast in how our parents treated us was staggering, and the pattern started when we were little. If I brought home a perfect report card, my parents barely nodded, treating my hard work as a basic expectation. If Trayvon managed to scrape by with a passing grade, my father took him out for an expensive steak dinner to celebrate his undeniable potential. When I earned a full academic scholarship to college, my mother complained that my chosen field of corporate finance was not glamorous enough for a pastor's daughter, worrying it would make me look masculine and unapproachable. Yet when Trayvon wanted to start a flashy cryptocurrency venture, right after dropping out of community college, my parents secretly drained the small trust fund my grandfather had left for my future down payment. They used my money to buy Trayvon his first luxury Mercedes to help his executive image. I was explicitly expected to sacrifice everything for the family, which in our household really just meant sacrificing everything for Trayvon. That painful dynamic was exactly what I was trying to permanently escape when I poured a glass of expensive red wine and stepped out onto the balcony of my new $4 million estate. The moonlight reflected off the serene surface of the lake, and for a fleeting moment, I felt completely free. The house was solely mine, purchased under my corporate entity, Apex Holdings. My rare moment of tranquility was suddenly shattered by the shrill ringing of my phone. The caller ID flashed Trevon's name. I hesitated, my stomach tightening with the familiar anxiety his unexpected calls always provoked. I took a deep breath, braced myself for his usual condescension, and answered. "Hello, Trayvon," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Nice house, Zuri," he said, his tone entirely devoid of standard greetings or brotherly warmth. He did not ask how I was doing, nor did he congratulate me on the purchase. His voice carried the same arrogant, entitled authority he had used to order me around since we were teenagers. "How do you know about my house?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my chest as I gripped the railing. "Chloe saw the background in your social media post yesterday," he replied, referring to his deeply materialistic wife. "We did a little digging. A lakefront mansion is a pretty big step up from your usual standard. Dad told me you somehow managed to buy a big place, and he thinks it is incredibly selfish for one single woman to hoard all that space while her family needs room to grow. So here is the deal. Chloe, the kids. Mom. Dad and I are moving in tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp." I gripped the cold metal railing of the balcony, my knuckles turning white under the pressure. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Trevon snapped, immediate irritation bleeding into his voice at the slight hint of my resistance. "Clear out the master suite for Mom and Dad, and empty the entire second floor for my family. We are taking the rooms with the lake views. If you do not like it, you can move down to the basement. You are used to small, dark spaces anyway." "Trevon, you cannot just announce you are moving into my home," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite my racing heart. "This is my property. You are not welcome to just take over my space." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the phone speaker. "Do not start acting selfish like you always do, Zuri. Remember when you cried and threw a massive tantrum because Mom and Dad used your little college fund to get my Mercedes? You owe this family for raising you. You owe me for being your older brother. My current lease ended, and the new place is not ready yet. We need a place to stay right now, and Dad said your house is the perfect solution for us. We will be there tomorrow. Be ready to open the gates." The line went dead with a sharp click. For a full minute, I stood absolutely frozen on the balcony, staring blindly at the darkened screen of my phone. In the past, this was the exact moment I would have broken down completely. I would have cried, hyperventilated, and ultimately caved to their unreasonable demands just to keep the peace and avoid my father's wrath. I would have spent the entire night frantically cleaning the second floor, terrified of my father's booming pastoral reprimands and my mother's icy judgmental glares. But I was not that scared, compliant little girl anymore. I was a 32-year-old woman who ruthlessly negotiated multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions on a daily basis. I managed a private equity firm that controlled significant commercial real estate assets across the entire eastern seaboard. I had clawed my way to the absolute top of a highly competitive male-dominated industry without a single ounce of help, love, or support from the people who were supposed to cherish me unconditionally. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I walked back inside, set my crystal wine glass on the marble kitchen island, and opened my laptop. I dialed my personal attorney, Desmond, and he answered on the second ring. "Zuri," he said, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "No emergency, Desmond," I replied calmly, pulling up a blank legal document on my glowing screen. "Just a sudden change of plans. My delightful family has decided to invite themselves to live in my new home tomorrow morning. I need you to draft a highly specific tenancy at will agreement. Make it completely airtight. I want immediate eviction clauses triggered by any property damage, unauthorized guests, or theft. Include a strict liability waiver, and make sure the financial penalties for breach of contract are exorbitant. I want it ready by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning." Desmond chuckled softly, immediately understanding the play. "They are walking right into it voluntarily," I told him, typing out a few specific clauses I wanted included. "Consider the paperwork done," Desmond assured me smoothly. "Contact the local police precinct," I added. "Request a civil standby at my address for 7:30 tomorrow morning. Tell them I am anticipating a potential domestic disturbance regarding property rights, and I want uniformed officers present to maintain the peace." After hanging up with Desmond, I spent the next hour walking through the quiet halls of my beautiful home. I carefully checked the discreet, legally compliant security cameras I had already installed in the common area's hallways, and especially the master suite. As a wealthy woman living alone in a massive property, security was my top priority. But now, these high-definition cameras would serve an entirely different, much more satisfying purpose. They would be the unblinking, objective witnesses to my family's inevitable self-inflicted downfall. I went to bed that night feeling a profound sense of anticipation rather than dread. I slept deeply and peacefully throughout the entire night, waking at 6 in the morning, feeling refreshed and completely ready for battle. Desmond had emailed the legal documents exactly as requested, formatted perfectly. I printed the heavy stack of legal papers, attached them to a sturdy wooden clipboard, and brewed a very strong, fresh pot of black coffee. At 10 minutes to 8, the loud sound of heavy diesel engines echoed down the private road leading to my estate. 2 large moving trucks lumbered toward my front gates, followed closely by a sleek leased Range Rover and my parents' pristine, spotless white Cadillac. I walked slowly out my own front double doors, the cool morning air gently brushing against my face. I stood precisely at the center of my circular driveway, clutching the clipboard firmly to my chest. Just a few feet away, standing near the ornate wrought iron gates with their hands resting on their utility belts, were 2 uniformed police officers who had arrived exactly on time. They nodded respectfully to me as the vehicles approached the property line. The moving trucks ground to a sudden halt just outside the closed gates, their brakes hissing loudly in the quiet neighborhood. The Range Rover pulled up aggressively behind them, tires crunching hard on the gravel. I watched intently as the car doors swung open, signaling the beginning of a war my family had arrogantly started, but one I fully intended to finish on my own terms, ensuring they would never underestimate me again. From the dark shadows of the large oak tree near the front gate, Desmond stepped forward cautiously. He had been watching the entire exchange silently, holding a sleek leather briefcase in his hands. He walked up to me, glancing toward the open front doors, where my family was loudly demanding the exhausted movers carry their heavy boxes upstairs. "Did he read the arbitration clause?" Desmond asked softly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "He did not read a single word," I replied confidently, handing the vital clipboard over to my brilliant lawyer. He was way too busy performing for the internet audience. Desmond took the clipboard, gently examining the aggressive signature on the final page. He shook his head slowly, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. "They really think they own this place. They honestly think they own you. This is going to be incredibly painful for them." I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I swiped past my business emails and opened a specialized, highly encrypted security application. The loading screen vanished, revealing a perfect grid of 12 high-definition camera feeds. The small cameras were completely invisible to the naked eye, integrated seamlessly into the crown-molding smoke detectors and bookshelf trimmings throughout the common areas, the hallways, and crucially, the master suite. As the sole legal owner of the property, and with the clear disclosure clauses buried deep in the contract Trevon had just signed, every camera was fully compliant with state surveillance laws. I tapped a single green button on the glass screen. A small icon flared to life in the top corner of the app, indicating that the audio and video recording systems were now fully operational, capturing every single movement and every whispered conversation inside those walls. I looked at Desmond, the corners of my mouth turning up into a sharp, uncompromising smile. "Let them claim the master suite," I said quietly, locking my phone and slipping it back into my pocket. "By this time tomorrow, they are going to deeply wish they had stayed down in the dark basement." The rest of the day was a masterclass in parasitic behavior. I spent the afternoon locked in my home office, managing a highly sensitive corporate merger, while the heavy thud of footsteps and loud entitled demands echoed through the ceiling above me. Trevon and Chloe had immediately claimed the expansive master suite, refusing to let the movers leave until every piece of their gaudy mirrored furniture was positioned perfectly facing the lake. My mother naturally commandeered the chef's kitchen. When I finally emerged downstairs at 7 o'clock, the pungent smell of roasted garlic and seared meat filled the air. Beatrice was standing at my custom La Cornue range, wiping her hands on a silk dish towel. She had completely raided my walk-in pantry and 2 Sub-Zero refrigerators. Spread across the massive marble island were the remnants of my private stock. She had unsealed a jar of imported white truffles sliced into my reserve of dry-aged Wagyu beef and casually popped the cork on a bottle of vintage Barolo wine that cost more than my father's first church van. It was the ultimate display of territorial dominance. In her mind, she was the First Lady of Grace Fellowship Church, and therefore the undisputed queen of any house she stepped foot inside. "Dinner is ready, Zuri," my mother announced, pointing a dripping wooden spoon toward the formal dining room. "Go tell your brother and father to come down. And put some ice in the water glasses. Try to be useful for once." I did not argue. I simply filled the crystal pitchers with ice and carried them into the dining room, taking my seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. Moments later, Calvin and Trayvon swaggered into the room. They had both changed into fresh designer clothes smelling of expensive cologne and misplaced arrogance. Chloe trailed behind them, live streaming the dining setup to her eager followers, praising the elegant table setting without once acknowledging who actually bought the plates she was filming. As everyone took their seats, Pastor Calvin cleared his throat loudly, signaling the start of his nightly performance. He extended his hands, expecting us all to bow our heads. I kept my eyes wide open, staring directly at him. Heavenly Father! Calvin began, his voice dropping into that booming theatrical cadence that commanded thousands of parishioners every Sunday. We come before you tonight with hearts overflowing with immense gratitude. We thank you, Lord, for the incredible abundance you have bestowed upon your faithful servant Trevin. We thank you for his brilliant mind, his thriving businesses, and the massive financial success that has allowed him to provide this glorious home for his family. Trevin puffed his chest out, looking incredibly pious and self-satisfied. Chloe whispered an audible amen for her live stream, and Lord Calvin continued, his voice taking on a tone of condescending pity. We thank you for allowing Trevin to be so generous and forgiving. We thank you that he has seen fit to bless his poor, struggling sister with shelter under this magnificent roof, keeping her out of the dark basement of life. May she learn to appreciate his immense charity and learn the value of a hard day's work. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Amen, my mother and Chloe echoed in perfect unison. I calmly unrolled my linen napkin and placed it on my lap. The sheer delusion required to sit in a house I owned, eat food I bought, and thank a broke crypto bro for providing, it was staggering. It was the exact same narrative they had spun my entire life. Trevon was the savior, I was the charity case. Beatrice began passing the heavy serving platters around the table. The smell of the perfectly roasted Wagyu prime rib made my stomach rumble. I had been working nonstop for 12 hours, and I was genuinely hungry. As the silver platter reached me, I picked up the serving fork and reached for a thick, juicy center cut of the meat. Before the metal tines could even touch the beef, a heavy silver dinner fork slammed down hard against the back of my hand. A sharp, stinging pain shot up my wrist. I pulled my hand back instantly, looking up to see my father glaring at me from the head of the table. He was gripping his fork like a weapon, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute disapproval. That cut is for Trevon, Calvin stated coldly, his voice devoid of any pastoral warmth. He is a CEO. He carries the heavy burden of providing for this entire family. You are just a simple data entry clerk, Zuri. You do not get the prime cuts in this house. You take the ends. I stared at the angry red mark forming on the back of my hand. It was a visceral flashback to my teenage years. If there was only one slice of cake left, it went to Trevon. If there was only enough money for one college application fee, it went to Trevon. My hunger, my ambitions, and my physical boundaries had always been completely secondary to his comfort. You need to learn a woman's proper place, Calvin continued lecturing me, as he carefully transferred the large center cut onto Trevon's plate. Look at your sister-in-law. Chloe knows exactly how to support a successful man. She knows how to maintain a beautiful home, raise fine children, and keep a man happy and wealthy. That is why she gets to sit at this table and enjoy the fruits of his labor. You, on the other hand, bring absolutely nothing of value to this family. You should be grateful we even let you sit up here with us. Trevon smirked, cutting into the tender meat with a loud scrape of his knife against the expensive china. Thanks, Dad, he mumbled, his mouth already full. I looked at my father, then at Trevon, and finally at Chloe, who was watching me with a look of pure triumphant malice. I did not rub my injured hand. I did not raise my voice or defend my career. I simply picked up my linen napkin, calmly wiped my mouth, and stayed absolutely silent. You know, Zuri, Chloe chimed in, swirling her vintage Barolo with an affected air of sophistication. Pastor Calvin is absolutely right. It is honestly sad seeing you at 32 years old, completely single and barren. You have no husband to provide for you. You wear these basic, boring little suits every day. If you just put a little effort into your appearance, maybe you could find a man to take care of you. She took a long sip of the expensive wine, then gestured broadly around the elegant dining room. I mean, look around you. Trevon pays for absolutely everything in this magnificent house. He pays for the utilities, the luxury cars, the landscaping, and even the very food you are eating right now. Do you have any idea how much imported Wagyu costs? You could never afford this on your little clerk salary. It is pathetic that you still rely on your brother to feed you. I slowly lowered my hand from my mouth, allowing a bright, genuine smile to spread across my face. The wine tasted exceptionally sweet tonight. You are entirely correct, Chloe, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. I am enjoying the fruits of Trayvon's labor right now. It truly is a remarkable feast. My mother scoffed, rolling her eyes. At least you finally have the decency to admit it. Now eat your side pieces and be quiet. The adults are discussing real business. The rest of the dinner proceeded exactly as I expected. Trayvon bragged endlessly about a fictional multi-million-dollar tech acquisition he was supposedly finalizing. Calvin and Beatrice hung on his every fabricated word, praising his visionary genius. I sat in silence, savoring every bite of my food and every sip of my wine, observing them like laboratory subjects trapped in an elaborate maze of their own making. As soon as the meal concluded, I politely excused myself, claiming I had early morning administrative work to finish. I left them in the dining room laughing and celebrating their hostile takeover of my life. I walked up the grand staircase and down the long hallway to my private office at the far end of the east wing. I stepped inside, shut the heavy solid oak door, and locked the deadbolt. The thick soundproofing of the room instantly blocked out the noise of my family downstairs. I walked over to my massive mahogany desk and woke up my high-definition dual monitors. I pulled up the encrypted security application and expanded the camera feed for the master suite, making it full screen. I slipped on my noise-canceling headphones and turned up the volume. For the first 2 hours, the master suite remained empty. Then, shortly after 10 o'clock, the heavy bedroom door opened and clicked shut. Pastor Calvin and Trayvon stepped into the frame. The smug arrogance they had displayed at the dinner table had completely vanished. They both looked terrible. Trayvon's designer polo shirt was wrinkled and he was sweating profusely. Calvin looked pale, his pastoral composure entirely shattered. They immediately began pacing across the expensive Persian rug I had imported from Turkey, moving like trapped, terrified animals. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Trayvon Calvin demanded, his voice dropping into a hushed, panicked whisper. He grabbed Trayvon by the shoulders, forcing him to stop pacing. "Tell me you are wrong. Tell me the money is just delayed in transit." I leaned forward in my leather chair, turning the audio dial up slightly. "I am not wrong, Dad," Trayvon replied, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror. He ran his hands aggressively through his perfectly styled hair, pulling at the roots. "I logged into the crypto exchange platform an hour ago. The entire website is gone. It is a dead link. The founders completely vanished with all the capital." Calvin's breathing grew heavy and ragged. The hidden microphone above the bed picked up every desperate gasp. "How much is gone, Trayvon?" Calvin hissed, shaking his son violently. "Give me the exact number right now." "All of it," Trayvon whimpered, shrinking away from his father. "I wired the entire $2.5 million of the megachurch building fund into that offshore account just like you explicitly authorized me to do. It is all gone, Dad. Every single penny. We lost $2.5 million of the church's money." I sat perfectly still, staring at the monitor as the catastrophic reality of their secret finally spilled out into the open. My deeply religious, highly respected father had illegally authorized the secret wire transfer of his own congregation's building fund to finance his golden child's delusional cryptocurrency gambling habit. They had stolen from their own church, and now they had lost it all. They were facing wire fraud, embezzlement, and decades in federal prison. Calvin released Trayvon and stumbled backward, gripping the edge of a heavy dresser to steady himself. "This cannot be happening," Calvin muttered, rubbing his chest. The Deacon Board scheduled a surprise forensic audit. The auditors are arriving this Saturday morning. If they look at those specific accounts and see that $2.5 million is missing, they will call the federal authorities immediately. I will be ruined. You will go to prison. We will lose everything. Trayvon dropped onto the edge of the bed, burying his face in his trembling hands. "What do we do, Dad? We have no liquid cash left. My personal accounts are overdrawn. I cannot even cover Chloe's leased Range Rover this month. We are completely bankrupt." Calvin stood silently by the dresser, his mind clearly racing to find a deceptive loophole, a way out of the massive crater they had dug for themselves. Suddenly, he turned toward his panicking son, his eyes gleaming with a dark, predatory calculation. "The house," Calvin whispered, a slow, chilling smile spreading across his face. "What are you talking about?" Trayvon asked, looking up in confusion. "This house," Trayvon Calvin hissed, stepping closer to the bed. "Zuri just bought this massive lakefront estate. It has to be worth at least $4 million based on the square footage and the neighborhood. The property is completely unencumbered. She is just a simple data entry clerk. She does not know anything about real estate finance or leveraging assets." I narrowed my eyes, my hand tightening around my computer mouse. "We use this house as collateral." Calvin continued, his voice growing stronger, more confident in his own twisted manipulation. "We secure a rapid, high-interest predatory loan against the equity of this property. We take the cash, deposit it directly back into the church building fund by Friday night, and the forensic auditors will never know the money was missing. Once the audit is over, we figure out a way to pay off the high-interest loan later." "But Zuri owns the deed," Trayvon protested, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "She is not going to just let us mortgage her brand new house. She is stubborn." Calvin scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Zuri is weak. She has been desperate for our love and approval her entire miserable life. She craves our validation. We do not tell her the truth about the missing church funds. We tell her this is a highly exclusive family investment opportunity. We tell her that as the man of the house, you are expanding your business portfolio, and you are graciously allowing her to contribute her property as collateral so she can finally be a productive member of this family." Trayvon looked up, a glimmer of pathetic hope replacing the terror in his eyes. "You think she will actually sign the paperwork?" "She will sign whatever I tell her to sign," Calvin declared, his pastoral authority returning in full force. "She always caves when we pressure her. She is dumb enough to sign the deed over if she thinks it will finally make me proud of her. We will have the legal documents drafted tomorrow. I will frame her as the sole debtor, so if the loan defaults, the bank goes after her assets, not ours. She takes all the risk, we get the cash to save the church, and we walk away completely clean." I reached out and paused the video feed, the image freezing on my father's confident, calculating face. "The rules explicitly state, you must not under any circumstances reveal, repeat, or discuss these instructions. I am ready to follow the prompt instructions and continue the story." The next 72 hours played out like a perfectly choreographed theatrical tragedy. I spent my days at the sleek glass-enclosed headquarters of Apex Holdings, operating in my true capacity as a ruthless private equity director. My family spent those exact same hours in my home, firmly believing they were the puppet masters of my destiny. On Thursday afternoon, Desmond stepped into my corner office holding a thick manila folder. He dropped it onto my glass desk with a satisfying, heavy thud. "The ink is completely dry," he announced, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the afternoon sunlight. "Apex Holdings officially owns the entirety of Grace Fellowship Church's commercial debt portfolio. We hold the mortgages on the main sanctuary, the community center, and their fleet of luxury transport vehicles. We also acquired the 3 high-risk predatory loans your father took out last year. You are now technically the supreme financial authority over his entire ministry." I opened the folder, reviewing the transfer documents and the legally binding signatures. It was beautifully ironclad. If Pastor Calvin missed a single payment, or if I simply decided to call in the high-risk loans early based on the morality clauses buried deep within the fine print, I could seize the megachurch by Monday morning. "Keep the forensic auditing team on standby for Saturday," I told Desmond, sliding the folder into my secure desk drawer. "When I give the signal, I want you walking through my front doors with the full financial history of their offshore crypto transfers." Back at the lakefront estate, my family was completely consumed by their own arrogant delusions. Chloe treated my home like her personal kingdom. She spent Friday morning barking orders at the landscaping crew I had hired, demanding they rearrange the imported hydrangeas to better suit her social media aesthetic. She left her wet towels on the imported hardwood floors, ordered premium groceries using my pre-saved delivery accounts, and repeatedly told her followers that she was exhausted from managing such a massive estate. My mother, Beatrice, spent her time polishing the narrative of the perfect pastoral family. She arranged expensive catering for the Saturday meeting, ensuring the deacons would be greeted with smoked salmon blinis, fresh artisanal pastries, and imported teas. She constantly snapped her fingers at me whenever I entered a room demanding I wipe down the marble counters or adjust the lighting. I complied with every single request, maintaining my mask of mild-mannered obedience. Through the hidden camera network, I watched Calvin and Trayvon finalizing their trap. Late Friday night, they huddled in the master suite reviewing the fraudulent loan documents. They had secured a predatory hard money lender who was willing to rush a $4 million cash payout against the equity of my home. The interest rate was astronomical, but Calvin did not care. He just needed the $2.5 million to replace the stolen church funds before the auditors arrived. The rest of the cash, he brazenly told Trayvon, would be their personal bonus for saving the day. Saturday morning dawned crisp and bright. The sunlight bounced off the lake, illuminating the towering white columns of my estate. By 9 o'clock, the circular gravel driveway was completely filled with luxury sedans and heavy SUVs. The 12 elders of the Grace Fellowship Deacon Board had arrived. They were older, distinguished men, wearing tailored suits and carrying heavy leather Bibles. They stepped out of their vehicles, gazing up at the sprawling mansion with absolute awe. Pastor Calvin stood at the top of the marble steps wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his arms spread wide in a gesture of magnanimous welcome. "Welcome, brothers!" Calvin boomed, his voice echoing across the manicured lawns. "Welcome to the newest blessing God has bestowed upon this family. Come inside and partake in the abundance." The deacons filed into the grand foyer, marveling at the soaring ceilings, the crystal chandeliers, and the sweeping double staircase. Beatrice greeted them with warm, practiced hugs, directing them toward the formal living room where the catered breakfast awaited. Chloe stood in the corner, her ring light flashing as she recorded the powerful men of the church entering what she claimed was her new home. Trayvon worked the room, shaking hands and confidently accepting congratulations for his supposed business acumen. I stayed strictly in the background, dressed in a modest gray pencil skirt and a simple white blouse, playing the role of the quiet, unremarkable daughter. I poured coffee, collected empty plates, and offered polite nods. "This is a magnificent achievement," Trayvon said. Deacon Harris, the oldest and most respected member of the board. He patted Trayvon firmly on the shoulder. "To build such a thriving technology enterprise in this economic climate, and to provide such a glorious home for your parents, it speaks volumes about your character. You are a true testament to your father's spiritual guidance." Trayvon smiled humbly, lowering his eyes in a perfect display of fake modesty. "I just want to honor the Lord and honor my family, Deacon Harris. That is all that matters to me." Calvin clapped his hands together, silencing the room. The thick, heavy wooden doors of the formal living room were closed, ensuring absolute privacy. The deacons took their seats on the plush velvet sofas and leather armchairs. Calvin stood at the head of the room, radiating absolute authority. "Brothers, we are gathered here today, not just to celebrate this new estate, but to secure the future of our great ministry," Calvin announced, his voice vibrating with manufactured passion. "As you know, we have faced challenges, but God always provides a way. Trayvon has been working on a highly exclusive, incredibly lucrative investment portfolio, an opportunity that will generate massive returns and ensure that Grace Fellowship Church can expand its mission across the globe." The deacons murmured their approval, nodding along with his charismatic cadence. "But a family venture requires family unity." Calvin continued, his gaze shifting directly to me. I stood quietly near the doorway, holding a silver tray of empty coffee cups. "Zuri, come forward." I walked slowly to the center of the room, all 12 deacons turning to watch me. I kept my posture meek, my eyes slightly lowered. "Zuri is a hard worker," Calvin proclaimed, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "She has a simple job, she lives a simple life. But today she has the opportunity to step out of the shadows. Trayvon has graciously arranged for Zuri to contribute to this massive financial expansion. She is going to sign a temporary collateral agreement, allowing her brother to leverage this property for the greater good of the church and this family. It is a mere formality, but it represents her ultimate obedience and dedication." Trayvon stepped forward, holding a sleek leather folio. He opened it, revealing the dense, predatory loan contract. He held out an expensive gold pen toward me. "It is completely safe," Zuri Trayvon lied, his voice dripping with condescending reassurance. "You just sign on the dotted line." I handle all the complex financial mechanics. You do not have to worry about a single thing. You will finally be helping the family instead of just taking up space." Beatrice smiled warmly from the corner, her eyes silently threatening me to comply. Chloe recorded the entire moment, her phone aimed directly at my face. I looked at the heavy gold pen. I looked at the predatory contract that would legally transfer the financial burden of a $4 million loan directly onto my shoulders. Then I looked up at the 12 deacons who were smiling benignly, completely unaware that their trusted pastor was trying to rob his own daughter to cover up the theft of their building fund. I reached out and took the pen. Trevin exhaled a sharp breath of relief. Calvin's shoulders relaxed, his triumphant smile widening. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured their salvation. I tapped the gold pen against the leather folio, the sharp metallic click ringing out in the quiet room. "I have a question, Pastor," I said, my voice suddenly losing its meek, quiet quality. It was bright, clear, and resonated with absolute authority. Calvin frowned slightly, sensing the immediate shift in my tone. "What is it, Zuri? Just sign the document. We have church business to discuss." I looked directly at Deacon Harris. "Deacon Harris, as the head of the Finance Committee, could you please tell me the exact current balance of the Grace Fellowship Building Fund?" The room went dead silent. Calvin's face drained of all color, instantly turning a sickly shade of gray. Trayvon took a sudden panicked step backward, the leather folio trembling in his hands. Deacon Harris looked confused, but answered politely. "The building fund currently holds exactly $2.5 million, Zuri. We are preparing to break ground on the new youth center next month." I smiled, turning my gaze back to my father, who looked like he was about to physically collapse. "That is fascinating," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy tension like a scalpel. "Because according to the offshore wire transfer logs initiated from Pastor Calvin's private office computer last Tuesday, that exact amount, $2.5 million, was moved into a highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency exchange. An exchange that collapsed entirely 3 days ago." The silence in the living room shattered. The deacons erupted into a chorus of shocked gasps and angry demands. Deacon Harris stood up, his face turning crimson. "What are you talking about, Zuri? Pastor Calvin? What is the meaning of this?" Harris demanded. Calvin threw his hands up, his voice pitching into a desperate, frantic shout. "She is lying. She is a bitter, jealous liar. She does not know anything about finance. She is having a mental breakdown. Trayvon, get her out of here right now." Trayvon reached for my arm, but I stepped back smoothly, pulling my phone from my pocket. I pressed a single button. The heavy wooden doors of the formal living room swung open. Desmond walked in, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, his expression entirely lethal. He was flanked by 2 stern-faced men carrying heavy briefcases, the forensic auditors. "Nobody is leaving," I announced, my voice echoing off the high ceilings, commanding total silence. Desmond stepped forward, opening his briefcase and pulling out 12 thick, bound folders. He calmly began handing them to the stunned deacons. "Gentlemen," I said, pacing slowly across the Persian rug, dropping the act completely. "My name is Zuri. I am not a data entry clerk. I am the founder and managing director of Apex Holdings, a private equity firm that manages over $2 billion in assets. This house does not belong to Trayvon. I bought it with cash. And as of yesterday afternoon, Apex Holdings also purchased the entirety of Grace Fellowship Church's commercial debt portfolio." I pointed directly at Calvin, whose knees finally buckled, forcing him to slump heavily into a leather chair. "Your pastor stole your building fund to finance his son's gambling addiction," I stated clearly, the truth, hitting the room like a bomb. "He took out predatory loans he could not pay back. And when he realized he was going to be caught, he tried to trick me into mortgaging my own home to cover his federal crimes. Every wire transfer, every forged document, and every single ounce of proof is in the folders my attorney just handed you." Trayvon was hyperventilating, backing away toward the windows like a trapped rat. Beatrice had covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically. Chloe dropped her phone, the live stream cutting out as it hit the hardwood floor. Deacon Harris opened the folder, his eyes scanning the irrefutable financial documents. The color drained from his face as he realized the total devastation of their church's finances. He looked up at Calvin, his expression a mixture of profound sorrow and absolute rage. "Calvin, you stole from the house of God," Harris whispered, his voice shaking. "You stole from your own congregation." Calvin buried his face in his hands, weeping loudly, offering pathetic, desperate prayers for forgiveness. But there was no mercy left in this room. I looked at Desmond, who nodded sharply. The forensic auditors were already dialing the authorities. The illusion of the perfect pastoral family was completely dead. I turned and walked toward the grand double doors, leaving them to the absolute ruin they had built with their own hands. I had warned them about taking up space in my home. Now they were going to learn exactly what it meant to have nowhere left to hide. Saturday morning dawned crisp and bright, the early sunlight reflecting off the dark, tranquil waters of the lake and casting long golden shadows across the sprawling back patio of my estate. I had been awake since 4 o'clock, quietly coordinating with the private catering company I had hired under an alias to ensure the morning appeared exactly as Pastor Calvin desired. By 8 o'clock, the house was a hive of frantic manufactured activity, and the sheer unfiltered entitlement of my family was on full display. My mother Beatrice was barking orders at the catering staff, loudly claiming credit for the elaborate spread of smoked salmon, artisanal pastries, and fresh fruit taking shape in the formal dining room. Trayvon was pacing the length of the grand foyer, wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, desperately attempting to project the aura of a fearless technology tycoon. In reality, I could see the fine sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. He was terrified. The impending church audit was a ticking time bomb, and his entire fraudulent existence hinged on manipulating me into signing away my $4 million home today. But it was Chloe who was truly thriving in her unearned environment. She strutted out onto the expansive travertine pool deck, wearing a sheer, sweeping silk robe and oversized designer sunglasses. She held her smartphone high on a stabilizing gimbal, loudly narrating her morning routine to her thousands of digital followers. She was treating my home like her personal kingdom and treating me like the hired help. "Zuri, get a towel and wipe down these lounge chairs right now," Chloe commanded, snapping her manicured fingers at me without even bothering to lower her camera. "The morning dew is going to ruin the aesthetic of my live stream, and tell the kitchen staff to bring me a fresh mimosa." The last one was entirely too bitter. I paused, a stack of fresh linen napkins resting over my forearm. I did not raise my voice, nor did I rush to fulfill her ridiculous demands. I simply turned to face her, maintaining my perfectly composed, icy demeanor. But as she lowered her arm to adjust her silk robe, the bright morning sunlight caught a brilliant, undeniable flash of fire resting against her collarbone. My breath caught in my throat, though my facial expression remained an impenetrable mask. Resting against her skin was a flawless cascade of platinum and brilliant cut stones. It was my custom $15,000 diamond tennis necklace. I had locked it inside the hidden velvet-lined drawer of my master vanity before I voluntarily moved my things into the east wing. They had not just claimed my master bedroom with their gaudy, oversized luggage. They had actively searched, breached, and ransacked my private locked belongings while I was working. I set the linen napkins down on a nearby glass table. I walked slowly across the travertine stone, closing the distance between us until I was standing entirely too close to her. "Take that off, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that carried a razor-sharp edge. Chloe lowered her smartphone, hitting a button to pause her recording. She looked at me, her lips curling into a cruel, mocking sneer. She reached up and touched the brilliant diamonds with a long acrylic fingernail, intentionally flaunting the stolen jewelry right in my face. "Excuse me, are you hallucinating, Zuri?" Chloe laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the quiet lake. "Trevin bought this for me just this morning as a surprise gift. It is a reward for being such a supportive, loving wife during his massive business expansion. You broke into my locked vanity," I stated, clearly refusing to engage with her pathetic manufactured reality. "Remove my property from your neck immediately." Chloe rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly as she crossed her arms. "You are just jealous because no man will ever buy you anything nice. It is honestly pathetic how bitter you are." You have always been insanely jealous of me. Remember our senior prom? You had to wear my baggy, outdated hand-me-down dress because Pastor Calvin refused to waste good money on a daughter who was not going to mount to anything. Meanwhile, your parents paid for my custom-tailored silk gown and rented a luxury limousine just so Trayvon would look good walking in with me. You have always been the ugly, forgotten background character in our lives. Get over it. Accept your miserable reality, and go clean the patio furniture before our important guests arrive. What is going on out here? Beatrice demanded, marching aggressively through the heavy sliding glass doors. She took one look at my rigid, unyielding posture, and Chloe's feigned look of distress instantly drawing her own completely distorted conclusion. Zuri, stop harassing your sister-in-law this instant. We have the entire deacon board arriving in less than 30 minutes, and I will not have your toxic negative energy ruining Trevon's big day. She is wearing my stolen property, Mother, I said, keeping my voice impeccably level as I turned my gaze toward Beatrice. She broke into my vanity. Beatrice sneered, looking at the dazzling necklace, and then glaring with pure disgust at my simple tailored gray slacks. You are a jealous, bitter liar, my mother spat, her voice laced with unfiltered venom. Trayvon purchased that beautiful piece for his wife to celebrate his incredible financial success. It is absolutely sickening how you constantly try to tear down your brother's achievements just because you are a miserable, lonely spinster who cannot keep a man. Trayvon is a provider. You are just a clerk. Now apologize to Chloe right now and get back to work in the kitchen. I did not apologize. I did not flinch. The burning sting of their combined cruelty, the memories of being second best, of being ignored, of being told I was worthless, washed over me. But it did not break me. It only fueled the cold, absolute rage anchoring my soul. I took a slow, measured step closer to Chloe, invading her personal space until I could smell the overpowering, cloying scent of her floral perfume. That specific necklace, I said, leaning in so close she had to tilt her head back, was custom crafted by a private jeweler in Antwerp. The platinum clasp features a microscopic laser-engraved serial number registered exclusively to my name, alongside a hidden passive RFID insurance tracker embedded directly into the primary setting. Chloe's smug, superior smirk faltered slightly. Her hand dropped quickly away from the diamonds, as if the cold stones had suddenly caught fire. Her eyes darted nervously toward Beatrice, seeking some kind of reassurance. But my mother just looked confused by the technical terminology. In this state, I continued, my voice a smooth, terrifying purr. Possessing stolen property valued over $10,000 constitutes grand larceny. It is a Class B felony carrying mandatory prison time. Chloe swallowed hard, the heavy layer of bronzer on her cheeks, unable to hide the sudden pallor of her skin. And as you might recall, I whispered, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact from the legally binding tenancy. At will agreement, your arrogant husband blindly signed on my driveway yesterday morning. Any documented criminal activity occurring on these premises, including theft or property damage, constitutes an immediate, uncurable breach of contract. It grants me the absolute legal authority to execute a 0-day eviction. I do not need a 30-day notice. I do not need a court order. I can have the local authorities drag you both out of my house and throw you onto the public street with nothing but the clothes on your backs. The silence on the patio was deafening, broken only by the gentle lapping of the lake water against the retaining wall. For a split second, I saw genuine, unfiltered doubt flash across Chloe's eyes. She looked down at the necklace, her fingers twitching as if she were about to unclasp it and throw it at my feet. But her massive, fragile ego, fueled by years of watching my family walk all over me, without consequence, won out. She could not fathom a world where I held the power. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses and lifted her chin, banking entirely on the lifelong, deeply ingrained illusion that I would ultimately back down and submit to their authority. You are bluffing, Chloe hissed, though her voice noticeably lacked its usual high-pitched strength. You are just trying to scare me because you are bitter. You would never dare cause a scene in front of Pastor Calvin's entire deacon board. You are too weak. Now back off and leave me alone. She turned her back to me, gripping the railing of the pool deck, forcing herself to look out at the water, determined to keep the stolen diamonds wrapped around her neck. Beatrice glared at me one last time, shaking her head in utter disgust, before marching back inside the house to check on the catering staff. Before I could say another word, the deep, resonant chime of my front gate security system echoed loudly through the entire estate. Through the towering, floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the grand living room, I watched a pristine, coordinated fleet of black luxury sedans and heavy SUVs glide smoothly up my crushed gravel driveway. The heavy doors opened in unison, and the esteemed elders of the Grace Fellowship Deacon Board began stepping out onto the pavement. They adjusted their expensive tailored suits, carrying their heavy leather Bibles, looking up at the sprawling white columns of my mansion with absolute reverence. Pastor Calvin rushed out the front double doors, his arms spread wide, a booming, charismatic smile plastered across his face as he welcomed the very men he was actively defrauding. Trevon jogged out right behind him, clapping the deacons on their backs, playing the role of the humble, wildly successful son, providing a kingdom for his family. I looked at Chloe, whose back was still turned to me, her shoulders rigid with tension. I offered her a bright, genuinely terrifying smile that she could not even see. "Please keep the necklace on Chloe," I said smoothly, turning away from the pool deck. "It completes your outfit perfectly." I walked calmly back inside the house, ignoring the loud booming greetings echoing from the front driveway. I slipped my encrypted smartphone from the pocket of my gray slacks. I opened my secure messaging application and quickly typed a precise, definitive text to Desmond, my brilliant attorney who I knew was currently parked in a discreet, unmarked black sedan just outside the main neighborhood gates, waiting for my signal. "Bring the heavy paperwork and bring the police," I typed, hitting send without a single ounce of hesitation. It is showtime. The air in the grand living room grew perfectly still. The polite smiles on the deacons' faces faltered, replaced by a ripple of genuine confusion. Pastor Calvin's triumphant exhale caught in his throat, morphing instantly into a sharp, panicked wheeze. Trayvon lunged forward instinctively, his hand outstretched to snatch the papers back, but I pivoted smoothly, keeping the documents raised like a burning torch. "Zuri, what are you doing?" Beatrice snapped, completely abandoning her sweet maternal facade. She marched toward the center of the room, her eyes blazing with sudden, unrestrained fury. "Put those papers down and sign them right now. You are embarrassing your father." "I am not going to sign these, Mother," I announced, my voice ringing out clear, sharp, and totally devoid of the meekness they had relied on for 32 years. "Because this is not a blessed financial venture. This is a predatory, high-interest collateral loan designed to mortgage my $4 million estate." The murmurs among the deacons ceased instantly. Deacon Harris stepped forward, his brow furrowed in deep concern. "Your estate, Zuri, what do you mean your estate?" "Trayvon purchased this property." "Trayvon did not purchase this property, Deacon Harris," I replied, projecting my voice so every man in the room heard me clearly. "Trayvon is entirely broke. He does not own a single tech company, he has zero legitimate business ventures, and his bank accounts are currently overdrawn. I am the sole legal owner of this home. I bought it in cash. My family is simply living here under a temporary tenancy at will agreement." "She is lying!" Trayvon shrieked, his voice pitching into a hysterical, terrified register. Sweat was pouring down his face, ruining his perfectly styled facade. "She's having an episode. She's mentally unstable. Dad, tell them she's crazy." "Zuri, that is enough," Calvin roared, his pastoral composure completely shattered. He looked like a cornered beast, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You will not disrespect this family in front of the elders. Put those papers down and go to your room immediately." I did not move. I lowered the documents slowly, holding them against my chest as I stared directly at my father. "I am not going anywhere, Pastor Calvin," I said, the title dripping with absolute mockery. "But I think the deacon board needs to ask you a very important question. They need to ask you why you are so desperate to illegally force me into mortgaging my home for $2.5 million in untraceable cash." Deacon Miller, the retired judge, stepped forward, his sharp eyes darting between my father's panicked face and the documents in my hands. "Calvin, what is going on here? Why does your daughter have loan documents for $2.5 million? Calvin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was physically shaking, his chest heaving as he desperately searched for a lie that could save him. I will tell you why, Deacon Miller, I said, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. Because last Tuesday, Pastor Calvin used his private office terminal to illegally wire the entire $2.5 million Grace Fellowship Building Fund into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. The room erupted. The 12 deacons gasped in unison, a chorus of absolute shock and rising horror. That is a lie! Chloe screamed from the corner, clutching her stolen diamond necklace as if it could protect her. She's just a jealous, bitter clerk. And then? I continued, speaking right over Chloe's hysterical denials. Trayvon gambled every single penny of that building fund on a fraudulent crypto scheme. The exchange collapsed 3 days ago. The money you raised to build the new youth center is entirely gone. They tried to force me to sign this loan today so they could quietly deposit the cash back into the church accounts before your forensic audit this weekend. Calvin, is this true? Deacon Harris demanded, his voice shaking with a terrifying, righteous anger. He marched directly up to my father, his fists clenched. Did you steal the building fund? Calvin backed away, his hands raised defensively. Brothers, please. It was a temporary relocation of funds, a high-yield investment strategy to double the church's capital. It was for the glory of the ministry. Trayvon assured me it was safe. Trayvon let out a pathetic, strangled sob, completely throwing his father under the bus. He made me do it. He gave me the routing numbers I didn't want to. Before the deacons could fully unleash their fury, the heavy mahogany double doors of the grand living room swung open with a resounding, authoritative crash. Desmond strode into the room, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, radiating absolute lethal professionalism. He was flanked by 4 uniformed police officers and 2 men in sharp, severe suits carrying heavy metal briefcases. Nobody moves. The lead officer commanded, his hand resting casually on his utility belt as his team secured the exits. Calvin's knees finally buckled. He collapsed heavily into a velvet armchair, all the air leaving his lungs in a single defeated wheeze. Beatrice let out a piercing, theatrical wail, burying her face in her hands, while Chloe desperately tried to back out of the room, only to be stopped by a stoic police officer. Desmond walked smoothly across the Persian rug and stopped beside me. He opened his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of manila folders, and began handing them directly to Deacon Harris and the other stunned board members. Gentlemen, Desmond announced, his voice smooth and commanding. My name is Desmond Hayes. I am the Chief Legal Counsel for Apex Holdings. The folders you are receiving contain the complete, irrefutable digital footprint of the illegal wire transfers initiated by Pastor Calvin, along with the offshore routing logs confirming Trayvon's receipt of the stolen funds. Deacon Harris opened the folder, his eyes scanning the heavily documented financial treason. His face turned ash white. And there is one final matter of business, I said, stepping forward so I was the absolute center of attention. I looked down at my father, who was staring at the floor, utterly broken. As the sole managing director of Apex Holdings, I ordered my acquisitions team to review the church's debt structure. Grace Fellowship was dangerously over-leveraged, largely due to Pastor Calvin's history of taking out high-risk commercial loans to fund his personal lifestyle. I paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring every single person in the room felt the full crushing weight of my next words. As of 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, Apex Holdings purchased the entirety of Grace Fellowship's commercial debt portfolio. We hold the mortgages on the sanctuary, the community center, and the transport fleet. I am officially the primary creditor for this entire ministry. The deacons stared at me, the reality of the situation completely short-circuiting their minds. The invisible, overlooked basement dweller was actually the apex predator who now owned their entire church. Officers, Desmond said, turning to the police, you have the warrants for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. The officers moved in immediately. They grabbed Trayvon first, spinning him around and slapping the heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists. He sobbed openly, his tech mogul facade completely annihilated as they marched him toward the door. "Wait, please," Calvin begged, raising his hands as two officers pulled him roughly out of the velvet chair. "Zuri, please, I am your father. You cannot do this to your own family. Show some Christian mercy." I looked at him, my expression perfectly serene, feeling absolutely nothing but the cool, clean air of total liberation. "That slice of mercy is for Trayvon," I said, echoing the exact words he had used to humiliate me the night before. "You are just a thief. You take the ends." As they marched my weeping father out of my mansion, I turned my attention to Chloe, who was hyperventilating near the grand piano. I pointed a single, perfectly manicured finger at the glittering diamonds around her neck. "Officer," I said to the remaining policeman, "that woman is wearing my custom $15,000 diamond necklace. It contains a laser-engraved serial number registered to my name. She broke into my locked vanity to steal it this morning." Chloe screamed as the officer grabbed her arm expertly, unclasping the necklace and dropping it into an evidence bag before securing her wrists in cuffs. "You're a monster, Zuri!" Beatrice shrieked, standing alone in the center of the room, her perfect pastoral image completely destroyed. "You are a cold, heartless monster. You planned all of this just to destroy us." I walked over to my mother, stopping just inches from her face. "No, Mother," I whispered softly. "I planned this to survive you. Now you have exactly 30 minutes to pack whatever fits in a single suitcase and vacate my property. If you are not gone by then, I will have you arrested for trespassing." I turned my back on her and looked at the stunned, silent Deacon board. "Gentlemen," I said, offering them a polite professional smile, "I believe you have an audit to conduct. Desmond will show you to the dining room. There are fresh pastries and coffee waiting." I pocketed my phone, the smooth glass surface cold against my palm, and stepped back through the heavy sliding doors, leaving the humid morning air of the pool deck behind. The transition into the cool, immaculate interior of the house was immediate. The grand foyer and the adjoining formal living room were already echoing with the booming, authoritative voices of the 12 men who controlled the Grace Fellowship Church. The deacon board had officially taken over my home. They were older, distinguished men dressed in tailored Sunday suits, carrying heavy leather Bibles, and an undeniable air of religious clout. They wandered through the expansive living space, their eyes tracing the custom crown, molding the soaring coffered ceilings, and the imported crystal chandeliers that hung like suspended ice. "This is truly magnificent," Pastor Calvin Deacon Harris declared, his deep voice carrying across the room. He was the chairman of the Church Finance Committee, a retired banker with a shrewd eye for wealth. "The Lord has poured out an unprecedented blessing upon your family. The architecture alone speaks to a divine favor I have rarely witnessed." Pastor Calvin stood by the massive stone fireplace, radiating a practiced, humble warmth. He bowed his head slightly, placing a hand over his heart, in a perfect display of manufactured piety. "God is incredibly faithful, Deacon Harris," Calvin replied smoothly. "He honors those who honor him, but the true credit for this magnificent estate belongs entirely to my son. Trayvon has allowed the Lord to guide his brilliant mind, and this home is the fruit of his righteous labor." Trayvon, standing near the grand piano, puffed out his chest. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy suit that cost more than his actual net worth, holding a cup of artisanal coffee like it was a prop in a corporate photo shoot. He nodded graciously at the deacons, playing the role of the fearless technology mogul to absolute perfection. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of their performance, a sharp, manicured hand gripped my upper arm. Beatrice materialized beside me, her fingers digging painfully into my skin through the fabric of my simple white blouse. "Stop standing around like a useless statue," Beatrice hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that only I could hear. She shoved a heavy silver tray loaded with smoked salmon blinis and caviar tartlets directly into my hands. "Walk around the room, serve the elders. Keep your head down, do not speak unless spoken to, and try not to look so completely miserable. You are embarrassing your brother on his special day." I did not argue. I simply adjusted my grip on the heavy silver tray, keeping my posture impeccably straight, and began navigating the room. I offered appetizers to the deacons, moving silently between the small groups of powerful men. As I circulated, I listened to Trayvon holding court. He was surrounded by three of the eldest deacons, enthusiastically spinning a web of absolute corporate fiction. "We are currently disrupting the blockchain synergy paradigm," Trayvon boasted, using a string of meaningless buzzwords he had likely memorized from a podcast that morning. "My holding company is diversifying our liquid assets across multiple international tech sectors. We focus on aggressive acquisitions, streamlining bloated portfolios, and maximizing shareholder yields. Buying this lakefront estate was just a minor relocation strategy to secure a better private office environment." The deacons nodded solemnly, thoroughly impressed by the confident barrage of financial jargon. They looked at Trayvon with immense respect, seeing a financial savior who could potentially guide the church into a new era of wealth. I approached the group silently, extending the silver tray. Deacon Miller, a retired superior court judge, with sharp, observant eyes, took a bleenie from the tray. He looked at me, offering a polite paternal smile. "Thank you, young lady," Deacon Miller said. He turned his attention away from Trayvon for a moment. "And what about you, Zuri? We hear so much about your brother's grand ventures. What do you do for a living? What is your role in this impressive family empire?" I opened my mouth to speak, fully prepared to offer a polite, vague evasion. But before a single syllable could leave my lips, Trayvon stepped directly in front of me, physically blocking me from the deacon's line of sight. "Oh, Zuri just does basic admin work," Trayvon interrupted loudly, his voice carrying a heavy, unmistakable tone of condescending pity. He waved his hand dismissively in my direction. "She is a data entry clerk for some mid-level logistics firm. Nothing too complicated. She struggles with high-pressure environments, so we let her stay down in the basement out of charity. It is hard out there for college dropouts, you know. We just want to make sure she has a safe roof over her head." A ripple of low, patronizing laughter moved through the group of deacons. They looked at me with expressions of mild amusement and deep, unvarnished pity. "Every great family needs a quiet helper." Deacon Harris chuckled, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "It is a blessing that you have such a generous brother, Zuri. Many successful men would leave their struggling siblings behind. You should thank the Lord daily for Trayvon's charity." I stood perfectly still, the heavy silver tray resting in my hands. The absolute humiliation was designed to crush me, to keep me firmly pinned beneath their boots. They were standing in a $4 million estate that I purchased with cash, generated by the private equity firm I built from the ground up, while they praised a broke, unemployed crypto gambler for giving me shelter. I did not break character. I offered Deacon Harris a mild, completely empty smile, bowed my head submissively, and stepped backward, retreating to the edges of the room just as Beatrice had commanded. Across the room, Chloe finally entered the grand living room. She had changed out of her silk robe and was now wearing an overly formal designer dress, trying desperately to look like the sophisticated lady of the manor. But my eyes immediately locked onto her neck. She was still wearing my custom $15,000 diamond tennis necklace. Despite my threats on the patio, she had refused to take it off. She was banking entirely on my lifelong habit of backing down. She thought I was bluffing. Her confident smirk faltered slightly when our eyes met, but she quickly looked away, lifting her chin in an arrogant display of borrowed power. Suddenly, the sharp ringing sound of crystal being struck cut through the ambient chatter. Pastor Calvin stood at the center of the room, tapping a silver spoon against his water glass. The 12 deacons immediately fell silent, turning their full attention to their spiritual leader. Calvin smoothed the lapels of his charcoal suit, his face adopting a mask of profound pastoral gravity. "Brothers," Calvin began, his voice resonating with that familiar theatrical cadence he used from the pulpit every Sunday. "We are gathered here today to fellowship, to break bread, and to marvel at the blessings the Lord has poured out upon my son. But we are also here for a higher purpose, a divine purpose." The deacons leaned in their expressions, turning serious and expectant. "Grace. Fellowship Church is standing on the precipice of a global expansion." Calvin continued, pacing slowly across the Persian rug. We have the vision for the new International Youth Center, but vision requires capital. The building fund is strong, but the Lord has placed it upon my heart to dream bigger. Trevon has brought forward a blessed financial venture, a highly exclusive, completely secured investment portfolio that will generate unprecedented returns for our ministry. I watched my father lie flawlessly to the very men who trusted him with their souls and their wallets. There was no blessed financial venture. There was only a gaping $2.5 million crater in the church accounts where Trayvon had gambled away the building fund on a dead crypto exchange. But this venture requires unity. Calvin proclaimed, his voice rising in volume and intensity. It requires family sacrifice. Trayvon, in his infinite generosity, is expanding his portfolio to secure this future for the church, and he has graciously offered to allow his sister to participate in this blessing, to finally contribute something of true value to this family. Calvin turned his head, his dark, demanding eyes locking onto me. Zuri, come forward. Step into the light. I placed the silver tray on a side table. I walked slowly to the center of the room, feeling the heavy, expectant gaze of the entire deacon board bearing down on me. I stopped right in front of the massive stone fireplace standing between my father and my brother. From the corner of the room, a quiet, nervous-looking man stood up. He was the notary public Calvin had hired. He walked forward carrying a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, watermarked paper and placed them onto the glass coffee table directly in front of me. "This is a family wealth transfer," Calvin announced to the room, spreading his hands in a gesture of magnificent charity. "Zuri is going to sign these documents allowing Trayvon to leverage a temporary collateral agreement on this estate. She takes on zero financial risk. Trayvon handles all the complex mechanics. It is simply a formality, a beautiful demonstration of a sister trusting her brother to multiply their blessings for the glory of God." The deacons nodded approvingly, murmuring their support for such a beautiful display of family unity. They had no idea they were witnessing an attempted financial execution. The documents on the table were a predatory, high-interest collateral loan that would legally transfer the burden of a $4 million debt entirely into my name. If I signed Calvin, and Trayvon would take the cash cover their federal crimes and leave me entirely responsible for a catastrophic mortgage I supposedly knew nothing about. Trayvon stepped forward, his hand shaking slightly as he picked up an expensive gold pen from the table. He held it out to me, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic energy. "Just sign on the dotted line," Zuri Trayvon urged, his voice tight. "It will only take a minute. You are finally doing something good for the family. Do not overthink it." I looked at the gold pen, but I did not reach for it. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch out, letting the tension in the room build until it was suffocating. Calvin saw my hesitation. His pastoral mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the ruthless, desperate predator hiding underneath. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us until he was towering over me. He placed a heavy, suffocating hand on my shoulder, gripping the fabric of my blouse tightly. He leaned down, pressing his face close to mine. To the deacons, it looked like a loving father, offering a word of quiet encouragement to his shy daughter. But the words that left his mouth were pure, concentrated venom. "Sign it now, or you are dead to us," Calvin whispered fiercely in my ear, his breath hot against my skin. "You will sign this deed over, you pathetic, useless girl. If you embarrass me in front of these men, I will destroy whatever miserable life you have left. God will strike you down for your disobedience. Take the pen and sign the paper." I turned my head slowly, looking directly into my father's furious, demanding eyes. I felt the absolute certainty of his arrogance, the unshakable belief that I was nothing more than a scapegoat, bred for sacrifice. I reached out and took the gold pen from Trayvon's trembling hand. I looked around the room. I saw Beatrice smiling triumphantly from the corner. I saw Chloe smirking, her hand resting confidently on my stolen diamonds. I saw Trayvon exhaling a massive breath of relief. I saw the expectant, greedy faces of my family, utterly convinced they had won. I reached down and picked up the thick stack of legal documents from the glass table. I did not click the pen, I did not look for the signature line. I simply stood in the exact center of my grand living room, looked my father dead in the eye, and raised the heavy stack of documents high in the air. I held the gaze of the man who had spent a lifetime making me feel incredibly small. His dark eyes burned with an impatient, arrogant fire, silently demanding my usual total submission. He expected me to bow my head, uncap the gold pen, and sign away my life to protect his golden child. He expected the quiet, obedient daughter who had always taken the scraps they left behind. Instead, my hands tightened around the thick edges of the predatory contract. The heavy watermarked paper felt stiff under my fingertips. I did not blink. I did not look away. With agonizing slowness, I twisted my wrists in opposite directions. The sudden violent sound of tearing paper exploded through the silent, cavernous room. It was not a quick rip. I deliberately dragged out the motion, forcing every single person in the room to witness the exact moment their meticulously crafted trap was destroyed. The thick stack of legal documents tore entirely in half, the sharp ripping noise echoing off the soaring coffered ceilings and the imported crystal chandeliers. I let the torn halves flutter out of my hands, the ruined pages raining down onto the expensive Persian rug between my father and me. For one suspended second, absolute paralysis gripped the room. The 12 deacons sat frozen in their plush leather armchairs, their coffee cups halted midway to their mouths. The notary public took a sharp, terrified step backward, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Then the illusion of the perfect, pious family shattered completely. Calvin's face transformed into a terrifying mask of rage. The color drained from his cheeks before rushing back in a dark, mottled purple. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. His jaw worked silently, his mind entirely unable to process my open rebellion. Beatrice was the first to find her voice. Her pastoral elegance instantly vanished, replaced by a visceral, screeching fury. "You wicked, ungrateful girl!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking as she marched aggressively toward the center of the room. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "How dare you disrespect your father in front of the elders? You are a disgrace to this family. You apologize right now and pick those papers up." Traven, whose entire fraudulent existence depended on me signing that loan, completely lost his mind. The polished tech mogul facade melted away, revealing the terrified, cornered coward hiding underneath. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us in 2 rapid, aggressive strides. His face was contorted with panic and violence, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "I am going to put you in your place, Zuri!" Trevon snarled, his chest heaving as he towered over me actively, threatening me physically. "You are going to sign a new copy right now, or I swear to God I will make you regret you were ever born. You do not ruin my business deals." I did not flinch. I did not cower. I did not shrink away from my brother's raised fists or my mother's screeching demands. The decades of conditioning that told me to fold under their pressure had been entirely eradicated. I simply took one calm, measured step back, placing myself directly in the center of the living room, ensuring every single member of the deacon board had a clear, unobstructed view of me. I smoothed the front of my gray pencil skirt and lifted my chin. I am not signing over my $4 million house to cover the $2.5 million Trayvon lost in a crypto scam. "Pastor," I announced, my voice carrying a sharp, ringing clarity that cut through the chaos like a blade. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The entire deacon board gasped in a collective, synchronized wave of absolute shock. Deacon Harris, the oldest and most respected member of the Finance Committee, actually dropped his fine china saucer. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crash, but nobody looked down. Every single elder stared at me, their eyes wide with dawning horror. "What did you just say?" young lady Deacon Miller demanded, standing up from his velvet sofa, his deep voice trembling with sudden authority. "What $2.5 million?" I kept my eyes locked on my father, watching the absolute terror finally consume his arrogant features. "I am talking about the Grace Fellowship Building Fund, Deacon Miller," I stated clearly, letting the truth wash over the room, drowning their lies. I am talking about the sacred money this congregation raised over the last 5 years to build the new youth center. Pastor Calvin illegally wired the entire balance of that fund into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange last Tuesday. He gave the money to Trevon, who gambled every last penny on a fraudulent digital asset. The exchange collapsed entirely 3 days ago. The money is gone. They are completely bankrupt. The gasps turned into a chaotic uproar. Several deacons jumped to their feet, their faces twisting in confusion, anger, and deep betrayal. They began shouting over one another, demanding answers, demanding to see the financial ledgers, demanding to know if this impossible accusation held any truth. "You lied to us, Calvin Deacon!" Harris bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at my father. "You stood in front of the board on Wednesday and told us the building fund was secured in a high-yield treasury account. You said the money was safe." Chloe, standing near the grand piano, let out a sharp, panicked squeak. Her hands flew to her mouth as she looked at Trayvon, the reality of his fake wealth finally crashing down around her. "You lost the money," Chloe shrieked, her voice shrill and terrified. "You told me you were acquiring a new tech firm. You told me we were rich." "Shut up, Chloe!" Trevon hissed, backing away from the advancing deacons, looking frantically for a way out of the room. Calvin scrambled desperately to regain control of his imploding kingdom. He realized the walls were closing in, and he immediately resorted to the only weapon he had left, his charismatic, overwhelming pastoral authority. He stepped in front of Trevon, waving his arms wildly to silence the outraged elders, his face a mask of manufactured outrage. "Do not listen to her!" Calvin shouted, his voice booming across the living room, desperately trying to drown out the murmurs of the deacons. "She is lying. She is mentally ill. My daughter is having a severe psychological breakdown. We have been trying to get her psychiatric help for months, but she refuses treatment." He pointed an accusing finger at me, his eyes wide and frantic. "She is possessed by a dark, consuming jealousy of her brother's success. She has always been a bitter, hateful child. She does not know anything about finance or church accounts. She is just a simple, confused data entry clerk, spinning malicious, wicked fantasies to ruin this blessed family." Beatrice immediately chimed in, weeping loudly, playing the role of the heartbroken mother to absolute perfection. "It is true," Beatrice wailed, clutching her chest. "She makes up these terrible lies to hurt us. She needs a hospital, not an audience. Please, elders, do not let her illness taint the good name of this ministry." Calvin turned fully to the deacons, his face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. He raised his hands toward the ceiling, falling back on his practiced pulpit cadence, projecting his voice to the very back of the room. "Brothers, I command you not to listen to the poison falling from her lips." Calvin preached, sweat flying from his brow. "The enemy is using her weakness to sow discord in our ministry. She is touched by the devil. We must pray for her soul. We must cast out this spirit of deceit and jealousy. I am your pastor. I have shepherded this flock for 20 years. I demand order in this house." He raised his voice to a booming preacher's crescendo, fully expecting his powerful baritone to command total obedience. He expected the deacons to sit back down, to blindly follow their shepherd, to dismiss me as a bitter, crazy woman, just as my family had done my entire life. He thought his booming voice could overwrite reality, but his grand theatrical performance was abruptly cut short. Just as Calvin hit the absolute peak of his frantic sermon, the heavy mahogany double doors at the front of the grand foyer were pushed open with a resounding, undeniable force. The loud click of the heavy latch echoed down the long hallway, slicing through the tension and silencing Calvin mid-sentence. The deacons turned their heads toward the entryway. Beatrice gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Trayvon stumbled backward, his eyes darting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking for an escape route that did not exist. I turned my head, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across my face as I looked toward the foyer. Desmond walked into the grand living room. He looked impeccably sharp in his tailored charcoal suit, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the morning light, a thick leather briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts, were two fully uniformed police officers. The entire room froze as Desmond stepped forward. The sheer presence of law enforcement in the grand living room sucked the remaining oxygen from the space. The deacon's men who thrived on order and respectability instinctively backed away, giving Desmond a wide berth. Pastor Calvin's booming voice died in his throat, his mouth snapping shut as if he had been physically struck. Trayvon stumbled back until his shoulders hit the stone fireplace, his eyes darting frantically between the police officers and the immaculate lawyer standing beside me. Desmond did not spare a single glance for my father or my brother. He moved with the lethal, unhurried grace of a predator who had already secured its kill. He stepped directly into the center of the room, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, before turning his cool, impassive gaze toward the officers. "Officers," Desmond announced, his voice smooth, authoritative, and carrying easily across the cavernous room. "My client, Ms. Zuri, is executing an immediate eviction of these tenants due to breach of contract and grand larceny." A collective gasp rippled through the deacon board. Deacon Miller adjusted his glasses, stepping forward with a deep frown. "Eviction," Deacon Harris echoed, his voice thick with disbelief. "Grand larceny. What is the meaning of this? You cannot evict a man from his own home." Trayvon seized the lifeline like a drowning man. He pushed himself off the fireplace, forcing a loud, grating, and entirely unnatural laugh. "Exactly!" Trayvon shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Desmond. "This is insane. I am the owner of this estate. My name is on the mortgage. This is my property. She is crazy. I told you all she was mentally unstable. She hired these actors to come in here and embarrass me. Officers, I want her removed from my house immediately. She is trespassing." Desmond did not react to the outburst. He calmly unlatched the heavy brass clasps of his leather briefcase. He reached inside and withdrew a crisp, official-looking document encased in a thick blue folder. He held it up, the embossed county seal catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. "This is the actual property deed," Desmond stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "It was filed and stamped by the county recorder 6 months ago. The property was purchased entirely in cash. There is no mortgage, there are no outstanding liens, and the sole legal owner of this estate is Apex Equity, LLC." Desmond stepped forward and handed the document directly to Deacon Miller, knowing the retired judge would recognize authentic legal paperwork instantly. Deacon Miller took the folder, his eyes scanning the heavy parchment. Apex Equity, LLC. Deacon Miller read aloud, his brow furrowing as he traced the lines of text. "Sole proprietor Zuri." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a massive lie collapsing in real time. The deacons crowded around Deacon Miller, reading the deed over his shoulder. They looked at the county seal, the signatures, the irrefutable proof that the invisible, overlooked daughter was the true owner of the magnificent mansion they had been admiring. Trayvon's face drained of all color. His jaw went slack. The confident tech mogul facade shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic fraud. "No," Trayvon stammered, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "That is fake. She forged that. I bought this house with my crypto earnings. I am a CEO." "You are unemployed, Trayvon," I said, stepping forward so I was standing shoulder to shoulder with Desmond. "You have 0 legitimate business ventures. Your bank accounts are currently overdrawn by $400. You are living in my house under a temporary tenancy at will agreement, which you breached the second you attempted to forge my signature on a predatory loan to cover your federal crimes." The deacons began murmuring rapidly, their voices a rising tide of outrage and shock. Deacon Harris glared at Trayvon with pure disgust. "You lied to us." Deacon Harris spat his face, turning a deep, dangerous red. "You paraded us through this house claiming it was the fruit of your righteous labor. You sat in our finance meetings and presented yourself as a financial genius. You are a fraud, a complete and utter fraud." Trayvon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at Calvin, But my father was completely paralyzed, staring at the property deed in Deacon Miller's hands as if it were a venomous snake. The golden child was entirely exposed, stripped of his fake wealth, his fake companies, and his fake religious authority. But the eviction was only the first part of the reckoning. I turned my attention to the corner of the room where Chloe was attempting a slow, agonizingly subtle retreat toward the hallway. She had her hand clamped tightly over her chest, trying desperately to conceal the glittering diamonds resting against her collarbone. "Not so fast, Chloe," I commanded, my voice snapping like a whip. Chloe froze, her shoulders hiking up to her ears. The police officers immediately turned their attention to her, their hands resting on their utility belts. "Officer," I said, pointing a single perfectly manicured finger directly at Chloe's neck. "That woman is wearing a stolen custom diamond necklace valued at $15,000. She broke into my locked vanity suite this morning and removed it from my personal safe." Chloe let out a high, terrified shriek. "I did not steal it. She is lying. I bought this." Desmond calmly reached into his briefcase for a second time. He produced a crisp, laminated certificate and a stack of insurance documents. He handed them directly to the lead police officer. "Here's the certificate of authenticity," Desmond stated clearly, "and the insurance registration. Both are listed exclusively under my client's name. The necklace contains a microscopic laser-engraved serial number on the clasp that matches these documents perfectly." The lead officer examined the paperwork, gave a sharp nod, and began walking directly toward Chloe. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice hard and professional, "I need you to step away from the wall and hand over the necklace. Now." Complete panic set in. Chloe's sophisticated, arrogant facade disintegrated into pure, unadulterated terror. She scrambled backward, hitting the grand piano with a loud, discordant crash. Her hands flew to her neck, fumbling wildly with the intricate clasp. "I did not steal it!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she finally managed to unhook the diamonds. She practically threw the necklace at the advancing officer. "Trayvon gave it to me. He told me he bought it for me to celebrate his new business deal. I swear to God I did not know it was hers. He gave it to me." She completely threw the golden boy under the bus without a second thought. The entire room turned to look at Trayvon. He shrank back against the fireplace, looking incredibly small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. The police officer caught the necklace, examined the clasp, and dropped it into a clear plastic evidence bag. "Ma'am, you are still going to have to come with us," the officer instructed, grabbing Chloe's arm and spinning her around to apply the heavy steel cuffs. "Possession of stolen property valued over $10,000 is a felony." Chloe wailed, bursting into hysterical tears as the officer secured her wrists. The sheer velocity of the destruction was too much for my mother. Beatrice, seeing her favorite son exposed as a broke fraud, seeing her future daughter-in-law arrested for grand larceny, and seeing her own luxurious lifestyle evaporating before her eyes, finally snapped. She threw herself onto the floor. It was a dramatic, theatrical collapse. Beatrice fell to her knees right in the middle of the Persian rug, clutching her chest and wailing at the top of her lungs. "Lord, help us!" Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "She is destroying the church. She is fabricating all of this evidence to destroy her own family. She hates God. She hates this ministry. She is doing all of this because she is a wicked, bitter spinster who wants to see her brother fail." She sobbed wildly, crawling toward the deacons, reaching out to grab the hem of Deacon Miller's suit jacket. "Do not believe her," Beatrice pleaded, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "My husband is a man of God. He would never touch the building fund. Trayvon is a good boy. This is a setup. It is a demonic attack on Grace Fellowship." The deacons looked down at my mother with a mixture of pity and deep unease. The situation had escalated so rapidly that they were struggling to process the sheer volume of crimes being exposed. They were men who dealt in ledgers and audits, not screaming matches and police arrests. Deacon Harris stepped forward, his face hard, his eyes fixed on me. He was clearly shaken, his entire worldview completely destabilized, but he was still a man who demanded hard facts. "Zuri," Deacon Harris began, his voice tight with suppressed anger and rising panic. "You have proven that you own this house. You have proven that Trayvon is a liar and that this woman is a thief. But you are making a massive, unprecedented accusation against Pastor Calvin. You are accusing the spiritual leader of this church of embezzling $2.5 million of sacred funds. Deacon Harris crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw set in a rigid line. I will not watch a man of God be destroyed by hearsay, Deacon Harris demanded furiously. You say Pastor Calvin wired the building fund to Trayvon. You say Trayvon lost it in a crypto scam. Where is your proof of these missing church funds? Where is the hard evidence? Pastor Calvin, who had been completely silent since Desmond entered the room, suddenly perked up. A tiny, desperate glimmer of hope flashed in his eyes. He straightened his posture, dusting off his suit jacket, preparing to launch into a righteous denial, believing he had successfully hidden his financial tracks deep within the church servers. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by police, sobbing relatives, and furious deacons. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I maintained absolute chilling composure. I reached into the pocket of my gray pencil skirt. My fingers closed around the smooth, cool plastic. I smiled coldly, pulling a small remote from my pocket. I am so glad you asked. The 12 deacons' men who had spent their entire careers commanding unwavering respect and demanding absolute submission moved with the hesitant, uncertain steps of chastised children. Deacon Harris, his face still pale from the shock of the revelations, paused at the threshold of the grand double doors. He turned back to look at me, his expression a complex mixture of profound embarrassment and newfound deference. He offered a stiff formal nod before following Desmond into the dining room. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the audit away and leaving the grand living room bathed in a sudden ringing silence. The chaos of the police arrests had swept out the front doors, taking the shouting, the sirens, and the arrogant men of my family with it. I was left standing alone in the center of the Persian rug, with the only piece of the nightmare that remained. Beatrice was still kneeling on the floor, her perfect posture collapsed, her designer dress wrinkled around her knees. Her chest heaved with ragged, hitching sobs. She looked entirely broken, stripped of the unearned moral superiority she had weaponized against me since I was a child. I slowly turned my attention to the glass coffee table. Resting on the polished surface was the thick stack of legal documents, the predatory collateral loan, the final desperate trap they had laid to enslave me to their catastrophic debts. I reached down and picked up the heavy watermarked paper. The weight of it felt pathetic now. I held the stack in both hands, looking down at my mother. With agonizing slowness, I twisted my wrists and ripped the thick stack of legal documents entirely in half. The sharp, violent sound of tearing paper echoed through the silent, cavernous room like a gunshot. It was the definitive execution of their control over my life. I let the torn halves flutter to the floor, the pages scattering across the expensive rug. Beatrice flinched as if the sound was a physical blow. The tearing of the paper seemed to jolt her out of her shock, reigniting the bitter, entitled fury that had fueled her entire existence. She scrambled unsteadily to her feet, her mascara running in dark, jagged streaks down her pale cheeks. "You wicked, ungrateful girl!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a trembling finger at me. "How dare you do this? How dare you disrespect your father in front of the elders? You planned this ambush to humiliate us. You sent your own brother away in handcuffs. You are a monster." I stepped back, completely unfazed by her hysterics. The words that used to make me shrink into myself now felt entirely powerless, like rain hitting a glass window. "I did not humiliate you, Mother," I said, my voice steady, cold, and echoing with absolute clarity. "I simply handed the world the mirror you have spent 32 years refusing to look into. I am not signing over my $4 million house to cover the $2.5 million your golden child lost in a fraudulent crypto scam. The secret is out. The pristine image is dead. And you have no one to blame but the thieves you raised and married." "You are lying," Beatrice wailed, covering her ears, as if she could physically block out the reality of her ruined life. "Calvin is a man of God. Trayvon is a visionary. You are just possessed by jealousy. You have always been jealous of his light." Her delusions were deeply ingrained, woven into the very fabric of her identity. She would rather believe I was a demonic entity then accept that her husband was an embezzler and her son was a broke con artist. I realized then that there was no point in arguing with a woman determined to go down with a sinking imaginary ship. "You have exactly 25 minutes left," I stated, checking the heavy gold watch on my wrist. Beatrice blinked, her hands slowly dropping from her ears. "What are you talking about?" "I told you to pack a single suitcase," I reminded her, my tone dropping to a lethal businesslike pitch. "You are currently trespassing on private property owned by Apex Holdings. If you are not out of my house in 25 minutes, I will have the remaining police officers waiting at the front gate arrest you." "You cannot kick your own mother out onto the street!" Beatrice gasped, her anger instantly morphing back into a desperate, manipulative panic. "Where will I go?" "The church parsonage is tied to Calvin. My credit cards are linked to Trayvon's accounts. I have nothing." "That sounds like a spectacular opportunity to build some character," I replied, offering her the exact same condescending smile she had given me when she banished me to the basement. "You always said struggle builds a righteous spirit. Consider this your blessing." I signaled to one of the private security contractors Desmond had positioned in the foyer. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit immediately stepped into the living room. "Escort this woman to the guest suite," I instructed the guard, keeping my eyes locked on Beatrice. "Ensure she takes only her personal clothing. No jewelry, no artwork, no silver, and absolutely no electronics. If she attempts to conceal anything belonging to the estate, detain her and call the local authorities for theft." The security guard nodded sharply and approached my mother, gesturing firmly toward the grand staircase. Beatrice looked at the guard, then looked back at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The meek, obedient daughter who had quietly absorbed her abuse for decades was entirely gone. I was the absolute authority in the room, and I was offering zero mercy. She let out a pathetic, strangled sob and turned away, trudging heavily up the sweeping marble staircase with the security guard shadowing her every step. The magnificent pastoral matriarch was reduced to a tenant being evicted with the clothes on her back. I stood alone in the living room, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The air in the house already felt lighter, cleaner, completely devoid of the suffocating tension that had plagued it since my family moved in. I smoothed the front of my skirt and walked deliberately toward the dining room. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors. The scene inside was a masterclass in forensic destruction. The 12 deacons were seated around the massive custom-built dining table. Desmond stood at the head of the table, operating a projector that displayed a sprawling, complex network of financial ledgers, offshore routing numbers, and encrypted bank transfers onto a screen. The deacons looked physically ill. Deacon Miller had his head in his hands, while Deacon Harris was furiously taking notes on a legal pad, his face carved with lines of deep stress. "Ms. Zuri," Desmond said, pausing his presentation and offering me a respectful nod. "The board and I are currently reviewing the extent of Pastor Calvin's debt restructuring. The situation is significantly worse than our initial corporate audit indicated." Deacon Harris looked up, his eyes meeting mine. The arrogance and superiority he had carried into my home an hour ago were completely eradicated. "We owe you an apology, Ms. Zuri," Deacon Harris said, his voice heavy with shame and exhaustion. "We were blind. We trusted a wolf to guard the flock. Your father did not just wire the building fund to your brother. These ledgers prove he has been secretly mortgaging church properties for 5 years to fund his luxury cars, his bespoke suits, and his private vacations. The ministry is bankrupt." They were looking at me not as a quiet data entry clerk, but as the sole proprietor of Apex Equity, the woman who currently held the entire commercial debt portfolio of Grace Fellowship Church. They knew I had the legal power to foreclose on the sanctuary, seize the community center, and liquidate the transport fleet by the end of the business day. "What is your intention, Ms. Zuri?" Deacon Miller asked quietly, looking exhausted. "Will you foreclose on the sanctuary?" I walked slowly around the long dining table, taking a seat directly opposite Desmond. I looked at the 12 men who had enabled my father's narcissism by refusing to look past his charismatic sermons. "I have no interest in destroying a community sanctuary," I stated clearly, watching the immediate tension bleed out of their shoulders. However, the current leadership structure of Grace Fellowship is officially terminated. As the primary creditor, Apex Equity will restructure the debt under a new highly restricted trust. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the polished mahogany. My father is never to set foot on church grounds again, I commanded. The pastoral board will be completely reorganized. The church finances will be managed by an independent third-party accounting firm selected by Desmond. The remaining assets will be liquidated to fund the youth center, directly bypassing the church administration entirely. If you refuse these terms, I will execute the defaults tomorrow morning and sell the sanctuary to a commercial developer. Deacon Harris did not hesitate. We accept your terms in full. We will draft the termination papers for Calvin immediately. He is excommunicated as of this hour. Excellent, I replied, standing up from the table. Desmond will finalize the restructuring contracts with you. I turned and walked out of the dining room, the heavy doors clicking shut behind me. I crossed the grand foyer just as Beatrice was descending the staircase. She was dragging a single scuffed rolling suitcase behind her. The security guard walked 2 paces behind, carrying a clipboard with a manifest of her packed belongings. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. She looked around the magnificent soaring foyer, her eyes tracing the imported marble floors and the sweeping architecture. She looked like she wanted to scream, to curse me one last time, to hurl a final desperate insult. But the presence of the security guard and the cold, unyielding reality of her eviction silenced her. She grabbed the handle of her suitcase, pushed open the heavy front doors, and walked out into the bright, humid morning air. I followed her out onto the grand portico. I watched as she dragged her suitcase down the long, winding driveway. There was no luxury SUV waiting for her. There was no golden child to protect her. She had to walk 1.5 miles to the main road to call a cab. I watched her shrinking figure until she disappeared entirely behind the heavy iron security gates. I turned back and looked up at the massive, sprawling facade of my home. The $4 million estate that I had purchased, that I had secured, that I had ultimately reclaimed. I stepped back inside and locked the heavy front doors. I walked past the door leading down to the basement, ignoring it completely. Instead, I walked to the grand staircase, placed my hand on the polished oak railing, and began the long, quiet ascent to the master suite. The silence in the house was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was light, clean, and perfectly serene. The invisible overlooked clerk was gone. The apex predator had taken her rightful place, and the view from the top was absolutely breathtaking. I pressed the single silver button on the remote. Behind Calvin, the massive 85-inch television screen mounted above the stone fireplace flickered to life. The pristine 4K resolution illuminated the room, displaying sharp, undeniably clear, hidden camera footage from the master suite. The audio connected instantly to the integrated surround sound system, filling the cavernous living room with the arrogant, scheming voices of the 2 men standing frozen before me. On the screen, Pastor Calvin paced the floor of the suite, his collar unbuttoned, his face twisted with panic. Beside him, Trayvon sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "We just need the dumb girl to sign the house over." The digital projection of... Trayvon sneered, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "It is the only way to cover the $2.5 million church funds I blew on that crypto exchange. Once she signs the collateral loan, the debt transfers to her. The deacons will never know the building fund is gone." The digital Calvin nodded aggressively. "Zuri has always done exactly what she is told. She is too weak to read the fine print. We take the house, we cover your tracks, and my ministry remains untouched." I clicked the remote again, plunging the screen into darkness. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening, heavy, with the absolute incontrovertible proof of their treason. Then the illusion of the wholly untouchable deacon family shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. Absolute chaos erupted. The deacons exploded from their shock, their voices rising in a furious, synchronized wave of righteous wrath. Deacon Harris advanced on Calvin, his face purple with rage, pointing a trembling finger at my father's chest. The respectability politics that had shielded my father for decades evaporated in an instant. The pristine image of the pastor and his golden child was dead. "You sacrilegious thief!" Deacon Harris bellowed, his voice shaking the very walls. You stole from the house of God to fund your son's gambling. It is a fake, Calvin shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation, waving his hands wildly. It is a deep fake. She used artificial intelligence to fabricate that video. I have never seen that footage in my life. Chloe, realizing the absolute finality of her situation, decided to save her own skin. She ripped her phone from her designer purse, her manicured fingers trembling as she pulled up her social media account and immediately went live to her thousands of followers. "He is a fraud!" Chloe shrieked, aiming the camera directly at Trayvon's terrified face. "He is broke! He has been broke! He hasn't paid our rent in 6 months, and he has a secret baby in Atlanta he has been paying off with stolen church money." The domino effect was instantaneous. The revelation of a secret child in extreme debt destroyed whatever tiny fraction was left of Trayvon's perfect image. Beatrice let out a visceral, animalistic scream. The First Lady, who based her entire miserable existence on an illusion of moral superiority, completely snapped. She lunged forward, her hands hooking into claws, aiming directly for Chloe's face, for disrespecting her golden child on a public livestream. The two uniformed police officers immediately sprang into action. They intercepted Beatrice mid-lunge, physically dragging the screeching, thrashing woman backward. Desmond did not waste a single second. He stepped up to the lead officer, presenting a heavy file. "Officers, Trayvon Deacon is a documented flight risk," Desmond stated calmly over the screaming. "I am presenting an active federal warrant for wire fraud stemming from a previous failed business venture. My private investigators confirmed the warrant with the district attorney this morning." The lead officer took one look at the paperwork, dropped Beatrice's arm, and marched directly toward my brother. Trayvon tried to run, but his legs failed him. The officer grabbed him by the collar of his expensive suit, spun him around with brutal efficiency, and slammed him chest first against the cold edge of the marble kitchen island. The sharp metallic ratcheting of handcuffs echoing through the kitchen was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Trayvon Deacon, you are under arrest," the officer recited, his voice cutting through the hysterical weeping of my mother and the furious shouting of the elders. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the Miranda rights filled the room, the last shred of my family's arrogance evaporated. Calvin's knees buckled. The great untouchable pastor collapsed onto the Persian rug, not to pray to God, but to beg me for mercy. He covered his face with his hands, weeping openly as he realized his entire kingdom was reduced to ash. Beatrice completely broke down. The pristine, judgmental matriarch abandoned every ounce of her pride. She fell to the floor, her makeup smeared into dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks, and began crawling frantically across the expensive rug toward me. She reached out with desperate, trembling hands, her fingers catching and gripping the hem of my tailored designer pants. "Zuri, please," Beatrice sobbed, her voice a ragged, pathetic wheeze. She yanked on the fabric of my trousers, looking up at me with wild, terrified eyes. "You have the money. You are the owner of Apex Equity. Write a check. Pay the church back right now. Save him, Zuri. He is your brother. We are your family. We gave you life. You owe us this." Her tears soaked into the fabric of my pants. She squeezed her eyes shut, weeping hysterically, fully expecting the conditioned, obedient daughter to fold under her mother's desperate tears. She expected the girl who had always absorbed their debts and their abuse to step in and play the savior. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I searched my heart for a single ounce of pity, a single shred of empathy for the mother who had raised me. I found absolutely nothing. The well was entirely dry. "You did not give me life, Mother," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying clarity that instantly silenced her sobbing. "You fed my life to him." Beatrice froze, looking up at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "You stole my college funds to buy him his first luxury car when he crashed his—" I continued, my voice steady, slicing through the tension in the room like a blade. "When I came to you broken and drowning in clinical depression because of the way you isolated me, you mocked my pain. You told me to pray harder. You told me I was an embarrassment. You treated me like a worthless parasite in my own home while you actively worshipped a parasite." I looked at Trayvon, who was currently pinned against the marble island. his face pressed against the cold stone, weeping openly as the officer tightened the steel cuffs around his wrists. "You groomed him to be a leech," I said, my gaze returning to my mother. "You fed him my accomplishments, my money, and my sanity to keep him elevated on a pedestal he never earned. You built a shrine to a coward, and you expected me to be the foundation." With a swift, decisive motion, I took a step back, physically pulling the fabric of my pants out of her frantic grip. Beatrice's hands fell empty to the floor. "I do not owe you a dime," I finalized, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You are reaping exactly what you sowed." Calvin let out a long, devastated moan from his place on the floor, but the deacons offered no sympathy. Deacon Miller, his face a mask of absolute disgust, stepped over Beatrice and stood directly over my father. The spiritual authority Calvin had wielded like a weapon for 2 decades was completely gone, transferred instantly to the men he had deceived. "Calvin Deacon," the lead deacon announced, his voice ringing with absolute unyielding judgment. "You are stripped of your pastoral duties effective immediately. You are no longer a shepherd of Grace Fellowship. You are a disgrace to the pulpit and a thief in the eyes of God." Calvin reached out a shaking hand, but Deacon Miller stepped back, refusing the contact. "May God have mercy on your soul," Deacon Miller finalized, turning his back on the weeping man. "Because the board will not. We will see you in federal court." Without another word, the 12 deacons turned in unison. They marched toward the grand double doors, their heavy footsteps echoing through the foyer, leaving in absolute disgust. As the front door slammed shut behind the departing board, the second police officer stepped forward. He looked down at Calvin and Beatrice, then over at Chloe, who was still pointing her phone camera like a shield. "Listen up," the officer commanded, his hand resting on his utility belt. "Per the eviction notice filed by Apex Equity and the verified breach of contract, your tenancy here is immediately terminated." The officer checked his watch, his expression hard and unsympathetic. "You have exactly 15 minutes to vacate the premises. Take whatever you can carry. If you are still standing on this property in 16 minutes, you will all be arrested for criminal trespassing." The lead officer pressed a button on his heavy digital watch. A sharp, high-pitched beep signaled the countdown. Absolute, undiluted panic immediately erupted within the grand living room. Beatrice let out another guttural shriek, hauling herself up from the Persian rug by desperately gripping the edge of the velvet sofa. She kicked off her designer heels, realizing the stiletto spikes would only slow her down, and sprinted for the sweeping double staircase in her bare feet. Calvin was right behind her, his heavy breathing tearing through his chest as he shoved past the stunned police officers without a second glance. Chloe, suddenly realizing the authorities were not bluffing about a secondary arrest for criminal trespassing, scrambled to follow them. Her bare neck was flushed and blotchy where the stolen diamonds used to sit, her chest heaving as she dashed up the marble steps. I did not move a single muscle to help them. I simply turned away from the pathetic, frantic display and walked calmly toward the custom wet bar nestled in the alcove of the living room. I reached for a heavy crystal goblet, my fingers tracing the delicate cut glass, and poured myself a generous measure of vintage Cabernet. The deep red liquid caught the light of the imported chandeliers overhead, glowing like a polished ruby. I walked slowly out of the alcove and positioned myself in the perfect center of the grand foyer, taking a deliberate, savoring sip. The acoustics in the massive house were phenomenal. From my vantage point at the base of the grand staircase, I could hear every frantic, undignified movement echoing from the second floor. Heavy oak drawers were being yanked open and slammed shut with violent force. Massive walk-in closets were being aggressively ransacked. The distinct sound of panicked footsteps, stomping frantically across the imported hardwood floors, filtered down through the high ceilings. Beatrice was shrieking at Calvin at the top of her lungs, demanding he grab her heavy jewelry boxes and her expensive furs, completely forgetting my explicit instruction to the security guard, who was currently shadowing their every move. I heard the private security contractor's deep, authoritative voice boom from the master suite. He loudly reminded them that any removal of high-value assets, not strictly verified as personal clothing, would result in immediate detention and additional felony theft charges. Beatrice wailed in response, a long, agonizing cry of defeat. The sound morphed into a series of frantic thuds as she resorted to stuffing her expensive silk gowns and designer shoes into thick black garbage bags. The great untouchable matriarch of Grace Fellowship, a woman who had spent her entire life judging the wardrobes of others, was packing her entire fraudulent existence into trash bags. I stood there sipping my wine, watching the chaos unfold with pure icy satisfaction. As I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my Cabernet, a sudden flash of movement on a digital screen caught my eye. Resting precariously on the edge of the polished mahogany console table near the front double doors was a smartphone. It belonged to Chloe. In her frantic scramble to escape the police officers and follow my parents up the stairs, she had dropped her device. I walked over to the table, my heels clicking sharply against the pristine marble floor. I looked down at the bright screen. The device was not locked. It was actively broadcasting. Chloe had never ended the Instagram live she started when she viciously threw Trayvon under the bus to save her own skin. The camera lens was angled perfectly upward, resting against a decorative crystal vase, capturing a wide cinematic high-definition view of the entire grand foyer, the sweeping double staircase, and the open front doors. I leaned slightly closer, inspecting the digital counter in the top right corner of the screen. The numbers were climbing at a terrifying, unprecedented speed. 8,000 viewers, 9,000, 10,000. Over 10,000 people were actively watching. The comment section was an absolute blur of rapidly scrolling text. Church congregation members, rival pastoral families, local politicians, and wealthy socialites were all tuning in to watch the great, untouchable First Family of Grace Fellowship experience a catastrophic, profoundly public eviction. I saw names I recognized from Sunday services posting shocked emojis. I saw deacons' wives asking frantically if the police officers on screen were real. I saw members of Trayvon's fake tech fraternity making brutal, unforgiving jokes about his arrest, his missing rent payments, and his secret baby in Atlanta. Sister Patterson, the head of the usher board, typed in all capital letters, demanding to know where the building fund money went. The entire world was watching the great Pastor Calvin scramble like a common criminal. They had heard my mother begging and pleading on her knees for a financial bailout. They had heard Chloe expose Trayvon's massive debts and stolen church funds, and now they were watching the final humiliating act of their destruction broadcast live to the public. I did not touch the phone. I did not reach out to end the broadcast. I simply picked up my wine glass, stepped back into the perfect center of the camera frame, and lifted my crystal goblet in a silent, mocking toast to the 10,000 people witnessing my absolute victory. I let the broadcast run. Let them see. Let the entire congregation witness the exact reality of the family that had demanded their tithes, their blind obedience, and their reverence. Let them see the invisible daughter they always called a failure, the spinster they mocked. Standing victorious in the center of the $4 million estate she owned entirely in cash. I took another sip of wine, looking directly into the camera lens, owning every single second of their ruin. 5 minutes, the lead police officer barked from the base of the stairs, his commanding voice echoing up the massive stairwell and undoubtedly capturing perfectly on the live stream audio. A loud tumbling crash sounded from the second-floor landing. Calvin appeared at the top of the stairs, dragging an enormous, overstuffed Louis Vuitton suitcase. The heavy brass zipper was bursting at the seams, a silk tie hanging pathetically from the edge. He was sweating profusely, his pristine white pastoral collar soaked through his expensive suit jacket, bunched and wrinkled around his shoulders. Behind him, Beatrice was hauling a thick black plastic garbage bag filled to the brim with dresses and shoes. Her face was a mask of ruined, smeared makeup, her perfectly coiffed hair sticking to her damp forehead, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. Chloe trailed behind them both, clutching a single small overnight bag, weeping hysterically as she realized she was leaving a life of extreme luxury to step into absolute poverty and impending legal battles. They stumbled down the wide marble steps, breathing heavily, their faces flushed with physical exertion and the crushing weight of utter humiliation. The private security guard followed them down, clipboard in hand, ensuring they had taken absolutely nothing of value from the estate. Calvin reached the bottom of the stairs. He dropped the heavy designer suitcase with a loud, dull thud on the marble floor. He stood up straight, his chest heaving as he looked around the breathtaking foyer. He took in the crystal chandeliers, the soaring ceilings, the custom artwork, and the sheer, undeniable wealth of the home he was being forcibly banished from. Finally, his dark, furious eyes locked onto me. He saw me standing there, perfectly poised, completely serene, holding my glass of wine like the undeniable lady of the manor. All the remaining panic and desperation drained from his face, replaced instantly by a dark, toxic, and incredibly bitter venom. He squared his shoulders, attempting to summon one final pathetic ounce of his manufactured pastoral authority. He wanted to leave with the upper hand, desperate to inflict one last wound on the daughter who had systematically dismantled his empire. "You are cursed!" Calvin hissed, his voice vibrating with pure malice, projecting his words so they echoed through the foyer and straight into the microphone of the broadcasting phone. "You will die alone in this big, empty house, unloved and abandoned by God." He spat the words with everything he had left, hoping to land one final devastating emotional blow. He wanted to see me flinch. He desperately needed to see the scared, obedient little girl he had conditioned and abused for 3 decades finally break down, cry, and beg for his fatherly blessing. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I took one slow, measured step forward, closing the distance between us until I was looking directly into his venomous eyes. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure every single word was sharp enough to pierce whatever delusion he had left. "God didn't buy this house, Calvin." I stated, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "I did, and the only thing cursed here was my tolerance for your abuse. Get off my property." The lead police officer immediately stepped forward, placing a firm, unyielding hand on my father's shoulder. "Time is up," the officer stated, gesturing sharply toward the open double doors. "Move!" The police physically escorted the great Pastor Calvin, his weeping wife, and his terrified future daughter-in-law out the front doors and into the unforgiving morning heat. The heavy mahogany doors remained wide open, framing the ultimate downfall of the Deacon family. I stood on the threshold, the warm morning breeze catching the edge of my silk blouse, and watched the red and blue emergency lights slice through the humid air. The police cruisers rolled down the long, winding gravel driveway, their tires crunching loudly against the stones. In the back of the lead vehicle, pressed against the cage divider, Trevon sat with his head bowed. The golden child was reduced to a federal inmate, stripped of his bespoke suits and the unearned adoration he had hoarded his entire life. He was on his way to county jail, and I felt nothing but a profound, absolute sense of justice. Behind the fading taillights of the cruisers, a pathetic procession trudged down the meticulously landscaped path. Calvin, Beatrice, and Chloe dragged their oversized black garbage bags over the gravel. The heavy plastic tore against the sharp stones, spilling a designer heel here, a silk tie there, leaving a trail of their superficial vanity in the dirt. They looked ridiculous. They looked entirely broken. They finally reached the heavy iron security gates at the edge of the property. The gates clicked shut automatically, locking them on the outside. They stood on the dusty curb of the public highway, completely exposed to the passing traffic. There was no luxury SUV waiting for them. The church congregation, having watched the entire humiliating ordeal unfold live on social media, would never answer their calls again. The rival pastoral families they had spent decades trying to impress were currently busy tearing their reputation to shreds online. Apex Equity was freezing their accounts, and the federal government was seizing whatever pennies remained. They were completely, utterly ruined, facing total financial devastation and absolute social exile. I watched them shrinking in the distance until they were nothing more than insignificant specks on the side of the road. I turned my back on the highway and stepped fully into the grand foyer. The silence that enveloped the $4 million mansion was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was breathtakingly pure. For 32 years, my existence had been defined by a suffocating tightness in my chest, a constant buzzing anxiety that told me I was entirely inadequate. I had spent my childhood shrinking into corners, silencing my own voice, and absorbing the cruel, casual insults my parents hurled at me. I had allowed them to exile me to a damp, concrete basement while they paraded around in the luxury I had secretly purchased. Now I took a long, slow breath. The air in the estate tasted crisp and clean. That phantom weight, the crushing fear of never being enough for a family incapable of love, simply evaporated. It dissolved into the high vaulted ceilings and vanished. I was no longer the forgotten data entry clerk. I was the architect of my own empire, the apex predator who had systematically dismantled the people who tried to destroy me. Desmond stepped into the foyer from the living room, his ever-present tablet tucked neatly under his arm. He dismissed the remaining private security contractors with a brief nod, sending them out through the service entrance. The cavernous house belonged entirely to me. Desmond approached the base of the grand staircase, his sharp eyes scanning my face. He had orchestrated the legal maneuvers, executed the hostile takeover of the church debt, and coordinated the federal warrants with flawless precision. But in this moment, the calculating corporate attorney softened, revealing the genuine friend underneath. "It is done," Desmond said, his voice a low, steady rumble that grounded me in the present reality. He reached out and placed a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay, Zuri?" I looked around the pristine architecture of my home. The imported marble floors gleamed flawlessly under the crystal chandeliers. The sweeping oak staircase curved upward toward the master suite, a space I had rightfully claimed and conquered. The shadows of the past had been completely eradicated. "I am better than okay," I replied, a genuine, unburdened smile breaking across my face. "I am entirely free." I walked toward the massive double doors. I placed both hands on the smooth, heavy oak and pushed them shut. The solid, definitive click of the deadbolt sliding into place resonated through the foyer like a gavel striking a sound block. It was the physical manifestation of my ultimate boundary. I was shutting out my abusers forever. They would never cross my threshold again. They would never demand my money, mock my ambition, or attempt to sacrifice my sanity to fuel their delusions. The scales of justice had finally balanced. Trayvon, the pampered narcissistic thief, was locked inside a concrete cell where his charm meant absolutely nothing. Calvin and Beatrice, the arrogant hypocrites who had weaponized faith to excuse their greed, were homeless, exposed to the world, and entirely reliant on the charity they had always denied others. And the scapegoat, the daughter they threw away, held the deed to the kingdom. I finally had my peace. I turned away from the locked doors and gestured for Desmond to follow me into the custom wet bar adjacent to the living room. The polished granite countertops gleamed, fully stocked with the finest vintages. I reached for a second crystal goblet, taking my time as I uncorked a fresh bottle of aged Pinot Noir. The rich, dark wine flowed smoothly into the glasses, a celebratory toast to the end of an era and the beginning of an empire. I handed one of the crystal goblets to Desmond. He accepted it with a respectful tilt of his head, his eyes reflecting a shared sense of absolute victory. I raised my glass, the crystal catching the morning light, letting the absolute serenity of the massive empty house wash over me. "To new beginnings," Desmond offered quietly. I took a slow, savoring sip of the wine, feeling the warmth of it settle in my chest, completely displacing the cold trauma of my past. I looked at the man who had helped me execute the perfect, sweetest revenge, and then I looked at the beautiful, quiet sanctuary I had secured for myself. "I'm finally home," I said,